This is a true supernatural incident that took place in Shandong Province in 1935. A man set out before dawn to sell tofu, but unexpectedly ended up drinking at a wedding banquet. Strangely, when he was found, he was lying in a mass graveyard with his mouth stuffed full of weeds and mud. The eerie nature of this event might exceed your imagination. Tag your boldest friend to read this together. Li Zongping was born into poverty. As a child, he was naughty and mischievous. Once he fell off a horse and broke his leg. Though a barefoot doctor from the village managed to set it, he walked with a limp ever since, earning him the nickname Cripple Li. Because of his limp and his family's dire poverty, Li Zongping couldn't find a wife. By the time he reached 35, he finally met a woman fleeing famine and managed to start a family. The next year, she bore him a healthy son. Li Zongping was overjoyed, thinking the Li family now had an heir. After his son was born, Li Zongping began pondering ways to supplement the family income. The first idea that popped into his head was making tofu. Tofu making was an ancestral craft in the Li family. Though it hadn't been their livelihood in his generation, the techniques and methods had been passed down. After tinkering for a few days, Li Zongping quickly mastered the process. Soon he was producing homemade tofu in bulk. At first, he sold the tofu only to neighbors. They could buy it with money or trade their own beans for it. Li Zongping's tofu was exceptional, fragrant with a rich bean flavor, tender and silky, melting in the mouth. Once it hit the market, sales surged like a floodgate had opened, and demand often outstripped supply. Seeing how well the tofu sold, Li Zongping decided to turn it into a full-fledged business. It was far more profitable than farming after all. So he and his wife officially started a tofu business and opened a small tofu shop. The villagers called him Cripple Li, and he didn't mind. He named the shop Cripple Li's Tofu House. With this new trade, he could no longer tend to the fields. The family's livelihood now depended entirely on the tofu. Selling only to the village wasn't enough, so Li Zongping began carrying his tofu to neighboring villages. Back then, beyond the village lay graveyards and mass burial sites. Afraid, Li Zongping always stuck to the main roads, avoiding shortcuts at all costs, terrified of encountering ghosts or bandits. One morning, his wife overslept. By the time the tofu was packed and ready, the sky was already growing light. At that hour, heading to the neighboring village market would mean arriving late, and he wasn't sure he'd sell out. Glancing at the sky, Li Zongping gritted his teeth and headed west without much hesitation. He walked quickly, soon drenched in sweat. After about an hour, he spotted a grand mansion by the roadside. It was clearly the home of a wealthy family, decorated with lanterns and bustling with people, full of festivity. Li Zongping found it odd. He'd lived in the area for years but had never heard of such a wealthy household, especially tucked away in this valley. Still, he figured it had nothing to do with him and prepared to leave with his tofu. But as he turned, someone called out to him. Looking back, he saw a well-dressed middle-aged man waving at him. Li Zongping hurried over, though he didn't recognize the man. Yet the man knew his name, which puzzled him. Had he forgotten this person? The man smiled warmly, laughing heartily. He clasped his hands and told Li Zongping that it was his son's wedding day, and he wanted to buy all of Li Zongping's tofu. Overjoyed, Li Zongping couldn't believe his luck. He'd never met such a generous customer. The man, delighted by his reaction, thanked him and asked him to bring the tofu to the kitchen. After setting it down, Li Zongping turned to leave, but the man grabbed his arm, pointing behind him and warmly inviting him to stay for the meal. Li Zongping scratched his head, hesitant. Normally, he'd decline, but for some reason, he felt an inexplicable fondness for this man, like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Seeing his indecision, the man ushered him into the courtyard. Once seated at the banquet, Li Zongping was stunned. The table overflowed with chicken, duck, fish, and meat, dishes he'd never seen in his life. When the wine jar was opened, the aroma awakened his every craving. His feet felt rooted to the spot. He couldn't help but wonder who this man was. Even the richest landlord in the village couldn't afford such a lavish spread. But with the feast underway, he had no time to dwell on it. He dug in ravenously, ignoring whether he knew the people around him. To him it was a heavenly meal. But halfway through something felt off. The others at his table barely touched their chopsticks, their faces expressionless, not at all like wedding guests. Then it hit him. He hadn't toasted the host yet. Mentally kicking himself, he thought, "They're not even relatives, yet they've fed me, and I haven't shown basic courtesy." He poured a full cup of wine, stood, and approached the host's table. Raising his cup to the middle-aged man, he offered a toast, but the man didn't respond, head lowered, silent. Li Zongbing raised his voice, but still nothing. Annoyed, he thought, "Is he ignoring me? Or does he not hear?" He reached out to nudge the man. The moment his hand touched him, Li Zongbing recoiled in horror. The man felt like a skeleton. Glancing at the table, his face drained of color. The plates no longer held meat but reeking black soil crawling with maggots. Terrified, he froze as the man slowly turned his head. What Li Zongbing saw was worse. The man's face was decayed, flesh gone, maggots wriggling across it. Dizzy with fear, he stumbled back, tripped, and hit his head hard on the ground, blacking out. He awoke in the dead of night, bitten awake by something, head throbbing. Several people surrounded him, including his wife, her eyes red with tears. His mind blank, he tried to speak, but she quickly covered his mouth, panicked. The villagers, pale and trembling, pulled him up and hurried him back to the village. Once home, he regained some clarity. His wife explained that he hadn't returned by nightfall. Knowing he'd taken a shortcut, she feared the worst and gathered neighbors to search. They found him unconscious on a wild grave in the mass graveyard, his mouth stuffed with dirt. Whether by someone else or himself, no one knew. Recalling the horrors, Li Zongbing shivered, soaked in cold sweat. He reached into his pocket for the money the man had given him, only to find rotting leaves and paper. Rushing to his tofu box, he opened it, empty. His wife and the villagers swore it was empty when they found him, unopened. Confused, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But if so, where had the tofu gone? For days after, he vomited everything he ate, black, putrid soil that stank horribly. When he recovered, he resumed the tofu business. Unexpectedly, it boomed. Word of his ghostly encounter had spread, embellished by the villagers, into a wild tale. People said his tofu was so good even ghosts came for it. Customers flocked from afar. Hearing the rumors, Li Zongbing could only smile bitterly, recalling his ordeal. But the tofu shop thrived, turning misfortune into fortune.